Let's examine the recent updates concerning NATO's highest military authority, the Military Committee annual meeting at the Chiefs of Defence Staff level at NATO headquarters in Brussels and its implications. We are joined from Brussels by Mr. Nicholas Williams, the former NATO official, and by Dr. Kamila Zarikta-Romanovska, the Professor of European Union Law and Security Studies. Welcome to Think Tank, Mr. Williams. How critical is this year's Military Committee meeting in shaping NATO's readiness for current threats amid the push for 5% defence spending?
Well, I think it's, as your report suggested, it's one of the most important meetings that the generals have had since the end of the Cold War, not because of the issues that they're discussing, but because it's a preparation for the NATO summit in The Hague at the end of June. And this summit at the end of June will, as your report indicated, try to agree on the 5% target to be spent on defense as a proportion of GDP over time. You suggest 2032. I think that's a reasonable expectation.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Romanovska, how binding are NATO's emerging defense spending targets, especially under the evolving political leadership?
One very important thing that the spending is becoming more and more serious for everyone, and this is quite a clever way to actually prepare ourselves for a potential withdrawal of US troops from Europe. That's an A thing, but a B thing is as well to ensure that Europe and the NATO countries, including those who are not EU member states, such as Canada or Turkey, are prepared for any possible outcome. This is actually something which will shape global security landscape for the future. And we cannot forget that this NATO Military Committee meeting, which is happening today in Brussels, will focus on strategic implication and geopolitical impact. This will be a turning point for global security. And I believe that this might be as well a potential to find a new way, a new solution to navigate quite complex threats. Because a part of ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, we have to redefine our approach to collective defense, deterrence and global partnerships. And this is a quite unique opportunity to actually define it today.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams, Belgium's backing Ukraine through the rearmament loans. How might this set a precedent for other allies' direct military financing commitments?
Well, the EU has already floated a similar scheme, 150 billion euros worth of loans in order to stimulate European industrial capacity for defense. And so this Belgian idea is one of a group of ideas, perhaps desperate ideas, to grow European defense capacity. And European defense capacity has diminished over the years, not because they didn't care about military things, but they didn't care about the right military things. They ignored until 2014 the threat from Russia because, paradoxically and ironically, the United States wanted the Europeans to accompany them in their adventures in the Middle East and across the globe. And so collective defense was ignored because the Americans wanted to ignore it. The Europeans, on the other hand, were doubtful about the direction the US was going, but the US is a leader in NATO, and what the US says usually prevails.
Mm-hmm. So you don't expect the rest of the European states would be dependent on the US military prowess anymore?
Well, I think the European states, EU states, and the wider Europe, and possibly Canada, will have to see what they need in terms of military capabilities to replace key military capabilities from the United States. It will take time, but it will need political will, and some countries have that will, some European countries don't have that will.
Dr. Romanovska, now considering the Russia-Ukraine war dynamics that are changing by the day and could be changing by tomorrow as well, how's the EU-NATO partnership evolving to ensure seamless support mechanisms for frontline democracies?
Well, first of all, we have to take into account that both NATO and EU member states, they finally enhancing defense industrial collaboration, and they actually finally preparing themselves on whatever will be the outcome. While we have to really observe that this has been catalyzed by Ukraine war, the movement towards defense industrial integration is far more than just word and reflex, and that's really important because it's systematic re-engineering of Europe's fragmented defense landscape. As the previous speaker said, it has been largely left aside, unfortunately, and now we really need a systematic re-engineering. We need a strategic redundancy. We need a scale and speed to expand capacity to produce artillery shells, for instance, air defense system, next generation platforms. So this is actually something which will indeed help with transatlantic standardization, because harmonizing NATO and EU requirements to support rapid interoperability in theater is really crucial. But at the same time, we have to take into account that in this very difficult issue, our industrial strategies needs to respond to strategic realities of fragmented global order, because the mark of geopolitically cultured globalization is selective, let's be honest, as well as alliance-based economics is security order. And we need to take into account that NATO and EU are not longer treating defense as national matters anymore, because it's way beyond, and relying on the market forces alone will be just insufficient. Building regional defense corridors like Baltic to Black Sea, for instance, in production chains, or coordinating export, especially in order to prevent dual-use tech leakage to adversaries, is really important. And I think that already what happened, and we have to give it to Trump, that this was inspired by him and his, let's say, forced encouragement, I would say. We can see that we are returning from state-driven industrial policy to actually creation of a real security framework, and it's both industrially but as well strategically. And this is how I really feel this particle summit in June, which will happen in Den Haag, but as well now the strategic convergence of NATO and EU within the Brussels. This really can happen to be some sort of checkpoint to institutional manifestation of new security consensus, when EU and NATO are no longer operating in parallel, but they finally have a strategic synchrony. And this will be a huge turning point, in my opinion.
Well, Mr. Williams, NATO's focus on defense industrial cooperation, does it signal the strategic shift to reduce the reliance on non-Western suppliers amid the global supply chain vulnerabilities?
Well, I think this is as your speaker mentioned, this is a really complex problem. The EU in itself wants to encourage EU-based defense industry, and it has rules to make it difficult for EU funds to be spent outside the EU on defense issues. There are ways of doing it, but it's very difficult. NATO, on the other hand, doesn't have this restriction, and they will cooperate with Japan, with Australia, with anyone who is like-minded. So there is a conceptual and political difference between NATO and the EU. If they could work together, as they have in Ukraine, that will be more powerful than if they work against each other or separately. But the issue is that the EU wants to build up, or some countries in the EU want to build up, what's called EU strategic autonomy, which is based on the defense of EU interests. That will exclude the UK, that will exclude Turkey, and it will exclude anyone else like Canada, who is a member of the alliance but not a member of the EU. So it's a very difficult issue, but pragmatically and realistically, things are moving ahead despite all the bureaucratic and political difficulties that been accumulated over the course of the past 50 years.
Romanovska, could the integration of cyber and infrastructure investments into defense spending redefine the understanding of collective security and what it means within NATO's framework?
Well, I hope you don't mind if I would just give a little top up regarding the EU defense funding, because I am as well expert on this matter. Indeed, mostly the defense funding, European Defense Fund, will be directed to the European stakeholders. But let's not forget that we have as well Horizon 20 and Horizon Europe as well, which is happening now. So while we are not speaking straightly on investing in a military domain, we are as well as a European Union, let's say, investing quite well with dual technologies. And with Horizon 20, we can as well cooperate worldwide to attract the brightest minds and to ensure that the dual-use technologies, for instance, in healthcare, might be transposed in the future, for instance, into the defense. But going back to what we can expect, the truth is that the spending is really important, and we have to see here that there will be critical issues, and we need to ensure that the global actions which might brought the military committee outcome can indeed go far beyond the defense, because we will basically ensure that, well, I hope at least, that this will be the outcome, that the global strategic competition will actually be finally created. Because if we redefine Euro-Atlantic security by institutionalizing support for Ukraine and creating durable defense production ecosystem, NATO and EU will finally be able to projecting long-term deterrence. And this will be not simple temporary solidarity, which is happening now. It's great, but it's just temporary. This challenge will bring some assumption in Moscow and Beijing, of course, that Western will resolve in short-lived. I think that the emergence of multi-threat theater planning, it's something which NATO can actually bring this in Indo-Pacific dynamics. For instance, within Japan, Australia, South Korea, this will reflect the regionalization of theaters. But at the same time, defense action in one region, like in Europe, of course, will influence. That's the reason why we need seriously acceleration of security economy nexus. And this is really only way to do it is with integrating defense planning with industrial strategy. And this is really a game changer, because financial policy and supply Brazil quiet for a long time, but it needs to move toward national security economics, where traditional distinction between civilian and military sectors will dissolve finally. So this has to happen in the regions, has to happen in the countries.
Mr. Williams, now given Trump's insistence on the higher defense spending, You've mentioned that as long as the European states share the same view, it would not be a problem, but could internal NATO divisions over burden sharing threaten the alliance's cohesion on the long term, especially with countries maybe outside of the EU?
Well, this 5% made up of some defense spending and some wider security-related spending is a smoke and mirrors. It will be an agreement to spend money on purposes which are undefined. But its purpose is to impress President Trump so that he can claim a victory over the Europeans and the Canadians. But the one thing that can affect alliance cohesion and coherence is the United States itself. If Trump pushes the Europeans too far and pushes them to increase expenditure and military capabilities beyond their economic capability, then the Europeans will, in the end, say no. They will refuse to spend that money, even if they promise it in the Hague. So that will, the Americans alone hold the secret to alliance cohesion. And if the Americans are conditional about European commitment to NATO, then the Europeans will react accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Romanovska, Brussels extends the rearmament loans to Ukraine. How do you assess the legal and strategic implications for future EU-NATO joint financial defense instruments?
That's a really important question, because the thing is that we are preparing for the worst. And that's something which really had to happen for a long time before actually anything happens today. We have to take into account that in this quite fragmentalized world, the war will not end within one day. And we have to ensure as well that when we are preparing ourselves, even for tomorrow meeting in Istanbul, we need to ensure that not only European interests, but as well global peace and stability will be ensured. That is important for European Union. That's as well important for the NATO, because this issue will dominate in certain contexts as well. Conference, the mediation process between Russia and Ukraine, and we as Europeans, we as NATO, need to ensure that certainly those actions which might be seen as let's call it a threat from other countries, they will not escalate, and they will not escalate more, and they will actually lead to stabilized tension. Well, short-term tension risk, like Russia will perceive most likely as rearmament roles, industrial mobilization, empowerment, forward deployments as preparation to the global prolonged confrontation, and we have to take it into account. This could as well prompt quite escalatory rhetoric and hybrid attacks, or increased alignment with pariah states such as Iran or North Korea. Long-term stabilization effects as well, they over time will credible nature posture combined with institutionalized EU-NATO defense mechanism, as well as EU investment within the European Defence Fund for both dual use and straight use for the defense measures. Predictably, in the currency of deterrence is extremely important. That's the reason why we need a stable and visible defense policies to reduce miscalculation, especially in the context of our key regions, such as Baltic, such as Black Sea, such as even Arctic. Normative escalation will be really important in this case as well. We need to ensure that the consigned seismic which will going to happen soon, and our actions will basically give us in good light when it comes to our more strategic narratives to rival powers, especially China's vision of non-Western global leadership. NATO can still be this key point to recommit to liberal values, and we need to ensure that our material readiness becomes the form of soft power as well as soft form of deterrence, I believe.
Yes. Mr. Nicholas Williams, the former NATO official, and Dr. Kamila Zarikta-Romanovska, the professor of EU Law and Security Studies, thank you both for your insights and valuable discussion. NATO's choices reverberate globally. Alliances are tested and new security paradigms emerge. One truth remains: everyone's watching closely, waiting to see if unity can outpace division in an era of escalating global tensions. That's all the time we have for this edition of Think Tank. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for joining us.